The National Association of Realtors has just dropped a major update to the NAR settlement, to the settlement that they have. A lot of big news here, and that's what we want to cover on today's Chris and Garry Show.
Welcome to the Chris and Garry Show. My name is Gary Kreth, and I'm joined here by,
Chris Scott.
and we are here to talk about all things real estate. By the way, if you like this video, if you like what you're hearing, make sure that you give us a thumbs up, like the video. Make sure that you subscribe so that you can get all updates. And don't forget to check us out online at thepaperlessagent.com. And with that, Chris, let's dig in.
Let's do it. So on April 26th, NAR most recently updated their FAQ documents. And there were a lot of little fine details that have some implications for us in real estate. I think probably one of the biggest things, though, I want to point out is they also published a timeline of when we can expect different things to happen. In fact, I think we should take a look at that real quick here. Looking at the timeline, and now this is an estimated timeline from the National Association of Realtors, but we can see from March 15th, on the initial date that the settlement was signed, all the way till November 22nd is when they plan on having the hearing for final approval, because there is a preliminary approval that the judge issued very recently as well. Now, within this timeline, we can see when the practice changes are going to be happening. I don't know about you, Gary. I thought it was pretty interesting. It was originally the practice changes were supposed to happen mid-July. Now I'm reading.
It's now been bumped a little bit. Like now they're thinking, late July-ish, right?
And
so
maybe
there's a lot of
maybe it slips. It sounds like they do have pressure to get it done by July. That's when they've referenced it in their FAQs, in their documentation. But there's a lot of stuff that has to change, and we're going to even talk about some of those things. What's interesting here, Gary, is we see that we have practice changes, and I'm assuming practice changes being things like having a signed buyer's rep agreement before we start showing homes. That's a big practice change that we're going to have to adapt to for a lot of people.
Sure.
That's one of them that it's going to take place. But you'll notice on September 16th, or mid-September, we're seeing that realtor MLSs and opting in non-realtor MLSs and brokerages implement practice changes by sometime in September.
Yeah, this is what's really interesting to me, Chris, is that what NAR is saying is that I, as an NAR member and member of an MLS, I will no longer be able to offer compensation in the MLS by late July. However, the MLSs don't have to adhere to anything until September 16th. So what does that mean? I mean, it's a little bit confusing.
It is, but I could see why this would be the case. If you're dealing with an MLS, you're dealing with technology, you're dealing with like having to do technological changes. So it's not like, hey, just change this practice. They literally would have to go in there and figure out the consequences of removing fields and so on and so forth, and having that show up in the MLS when people search it. So they probably need a little bit more time. So I thought this was a very interesting update. This timeline, very useful, just to give us some perspective on when do we need to be ready by. Gary, now let's get into the updates in the FAQ documentation that was released on April 26th. There's a lot of small things that have big consequences, or potentially big consequences, and some things that they clarified that I think are very helpful for us. So we'll just dive right in. I think one of the, as I go through that documentation, and there are numbers. So if you ever download the FAQs, we're referencing numbers from those bullet points. But Gary, when I look at number 37, it says, and this is a new thing because it talks about how long until the offer of compensation field needs to be removed from the MLSs. It does say the practice changes will go into effect late July, but there's a little bit of a discrepancy there. We were just looking at the timeline. It said mid-September, late July. So I'm
for the MLSs to make the changes, but as a practice, we as realtors must make those changes end of July.
Right. Now, moving along, let's see here. I think what was really helpful in the most recent documentation, and it's starting around like point 46, where they start talking about and defining what does it mean to be working with a buyer. And you and I were talking about this earlier because it's kind of interesting, the definition that they've provided with us.
Very interesting, because this, in my mind, working with a buyer means that I'm advising a buyer, I'm consulting with them, I'm sending them properties. That in my mind, that's working with a buyer. That's not what this document says, though.
No, this document says that you're working with a buyer once you start showing properties.
And I think they call it, actually, if we get super technical, touring a home.
Touring a home.
So now this leaves open interpretation. What is touring a home? Could it be me shooting a FaceTime video, touring the home with them on
Mhm.
FaceTime, or is this in person? There's a lot of clarification that needs to be made around that. But the point is that it appears that I can do everything to consult a buyer
Mm.
up until the point I tour a home. Once that touring a home is about to start, I must have a buyer representation agreement in place.
Now, for you, like, so that applies a very specific definition to what it means to be working. Because if I were to ask you, hey, Gary, what does it mean to be working with a buyer prior to that definition? What would you have said it was?
My definition of working with a buyer is that I am having an initial consultation with them, that we decide to work together,
Mm.
and that they decide, yes, I am hiring you before I even set up an MLS search,
Mm.
before I even start going out, checking out properties for them, before I really advise them
Mm.
on what they need to be doing based on their needs, their wants, and their concerns. That to me is working with a buyer. But that is not what this document says.
Well, it's helpful to know because the more clarity they can provide in what these terms mean, the better chances we have to adhere to them.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. So as long as I know, wow, before I tour a home with that buyer, I must have a written buyer
mm.
rep agreement. That adds a lot of clarity across the board. I think we can all figure out how to do that.
Now, I do. Now, we were talking earlier about, hey, what about FaceTime if you're going to do it virtually? If you look at point 48, they do provide some definition to what does it mean to tour a home.
Mhm.
And I'll just read it really quickly. It says written buyer agreements are required before a buyer tours a home for the sale listed on the MLS. Touring a home means when the buyer and or MLS participant or other agent at the direction of the MLS participant working with the buyer enters the house. This includes when the MLS participant or other agent at the direction of the MLS participant working with a buyer enters the home to provide a live virtual tour to a buyer not physically present. A home means a residential property consisting of not less than one nor more than 4 residential dwelling units.
So does this mean that I can enter a home, record a video, then send it
Ooh,
to you because it's not
I
live?
don't know. That's a really interesting thing because for us, for example, a normal part of our listing marketing strategies is we do a lot of video and we record video of that. If I'm recording that video, and I could see how that might be a little bit of a gray area, not quite
Yeah.
understood. Because if you record a video and you send it to somebody versus it being here they talk about a live virtual tour, that is different if I record it and send it to you after. So obviously that'll be something that needs to be worked out or further clarification might be needed. Gary, here is a very interesting update or clarification that they provided because it relates to open houses, and there's been a lot of discussion about how will the practice changes affect open houses,
Yeah,
and
lots of confusion here.
so I was reading in here. I think it's point number 50 in the on the FAQs from April 26. It says if there's a question and an answer format for this particular one. It says if an MLS participant hosts an open house or provides access to a property on behalf of the seller only, that part is underlined, on behalf of the seller only, to an unrepresented buyer, will they be required to enter into a written agreement with those buyers touring the home?
And absolutely not. And here's why. Unrepresented buyers can always go unrepresented to purchase a home.
Mm.
But what this clarifies is that if I'm going to open the home to an unrepresented buyer, I must clearly represent the seller
Mm-hmm.
or be a sub-agent of the seller's broker. So that's what's really, really important here is that I can no longer just go open a house for an unrepresented buyer that I don't represent the seller on
Mm-hmm.
or the buyer on. I
Gotcha.
have to represent somebody.
All right. So in this case, if you're doing an open house, you represent the seller only. And then anybody who
We're
comes
good.
in that open house, they don't need to have, according to this most recent update, they don't need to have a written buyer's agreement signed with you to see that home. And I think that
Right.
actually there's even some more clarification that's been provided on point 51 because ask the question: are written buyer agreements required when a listing agent talks with a buyer? So not just at an open house, but let's say a buyer contacts you directly if you talk with a buyer on behalf of the seller only, or as subagents of the seller. And again, they say no. If the MLS participant is working only as an agent or subagent of the seller, then the participant is not working for the buyer. And in that scenario, an agreement is not required because the participant is performing work for the seller and not the buyer.
Right. Absolutely. So very, very clear. If I represent the buyer, represent the seller or a subagent of the seller or their broker, I don't have to have a written agreement. If I do not represent them, it's pretty clear.
Gotcha.
Going to have a buyer representation agreement.
Now, up until the other day, I would have said point 52 didn't really have any real connection to me until Zillow released their
Their touring guide,
their touring agreement. When I first read that, I was like, oh, that's interesting. It'll be hard for someone who's not getting compensated. But now all of a sudden, I don't know if it connects dots or anything. I just found it a point of interest. So in point 52, and this one required a little bit of an explanation for me, are written buyer agreements required when an MLS participants perform ministerial acts? And so, yes, the obligation is triggered once the MLS participant is working with that buyer and the buyer is taking them to tour a home, regardless of what other acts the MLS participant performs. But there's a but here, Gary. But an MLS participant performing only ministerial acts without the expectation of being paid for those acts and who has not taken the buyer to tour a home is not working for the buyer.
Makes total sense to me, because here's the thing. If a buyer calls me out of the blue and says, hey, I just need some advice. I'm looking for a house and this is, I'm like, okay, let's have a chat.
That would be a ministerial act in this thing.
Absolutely. Yes. Now, I can have as many of those chats, consultations, whatever it may be, as necessary, without any expectation of compensation under those acts, until I show them a home or until I have an expectation of compensation. At that point, what this is saying, I must have a buyer representation agreement. Makes total sense to me.
Gotcha. Cool. And that Zillow one, that's probably worth talking about a little bit. That made some news. That made a lot of comments online I was reading about. The gist of it is Zillow recently released a touring agreement in which basically it's a limited time agreement. There's no expectation of compensation on that agreement.
Actually, that's not true. Oh. That's not true, Chris. There is an expectation of compensation of zero.
Oh,
so
okay.
Remember,
okay.
It must be clearly defined. The expectation of compensation is something, but it does not say what that is, how much money it is, what percentage, how much per hour. It doesn't say, and it can be zero.
Gotcha. Now, when I first read the news article on that, I thought to myself, well, how would that work? I'm going to go show homes for a person for a week or so, and what if they want to write an offer on one of the homes that we look at? I'm not going to get paid for that work. Is there any kind of workaround from that, or is it possible, let's say in the future, where perhaps writing offers is separated from that activity, and if you want to write an offer on
that's a really great observation, Chris.
Right. So then
we absolutely under this guideline, it makes sense that I could have a $0 touring fee, and then maybe written into the agreement when they're ready to write an offer on one of the homes I tour them. We then shift to a compensation.
Gotcha.
That is, according to this, that
could potentially be an option. That could potentially be an option. Now, obviously, there is so much more between now and when these practice changes are going to go into effect, where more information is going to be revealed. There's going to be a lot more updates as we get closer and closer to these dates. I think these represent some of the highlight ones that were released on April 26th. If you want to get more information, it's on the National Association of Realtors website. We've also been talking about it in our trainings and things that we've been doing at the Paperless Agent, so you can definitely check us out there. And if you liked what you heard today and you want to get more of it, please be sure to like this video, follow our channel, and check us out at thepaperlessagent.com. Thank you, and we'll see you in our next episode.